Already over 100 people on the webinar. This is a topic I think that a lot of people are very interested in. As I said earlier, my name is Tom Fazzini. I am the Communications Director for the Alliance for the Great Lakes. We are here today to talk about the federal government, for an update on where things stand with the Great Lakes and the federal government, a look at some of our just released federal priorities. This is the pieces of legislation and actions we'd like the federal government to take in service of protecting the Great Lakes, and then a look ahead at what might be happening in 2026. I am joined today by Joel Brammeier. He is the president and CEO of the Alliance, where he leads a team of professionals across the region, along with a base of more than 10,000 volunteers dedicated to protecting clean water and building a sustainable future for the Great Lakes. I'm also joined by Megan Cunningham. She is the Alliance's vice president for programs. Megan leads the Alliance's team that advances our advocacy around issues we're discussing today, our research on those issues, and our community partnerships around the Great Lakes. So I mentioned we're going to be talking today about federal priorities. A little bit first about the Alliance for the Great Lakes. For more than 50 years, we've been a nonpartisan nonprofit working across the region to protect our most precious resource, which is the fresh, clean, and natural waters of the Great Lakes. Our staff is headquartered in Chicago with additional offices across the region. Tens of millions of Americans rely on the Great Lakes for their drinking water. It contains about more than 20% of the world's surface fresh water. The lakes are also economic engines for the region, generating billions of dollars in the fishing, recreation, and tourism industries. The lakes contain critical manufacturing centers, 6 of the top 10 corn-producing states in the country, major American cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee. We are, in short, a large, diverse region and reflective of a wide range of American experiences, and that's reflected in our representation in Washington. Between the House and the Senate, there's 129 members of Congress from the Great Lakes states, and the partisan split is fairly even between them. So that's why our briefing today on federal priorities is so important and timely. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joel.
Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon. And first of all, I want to say thank you to all of you who are on the call today. I know it's a combination of Alliance for the Great Lakes volunteers, some of our financial supporters, some of our partners, and just people who are just interested in getting to know us for the first time. So appreciate you making the time to join us today. I'm happy to be joined by my fellow panelist, Megan Cunningham, our Vice President of Programs here at the Alliance, who you'll hear from in just a moment. Before we jump in, I just want to give a little bit of context about why we are going to talk a lot about what we think the Great Lakes region can accomplish in a time that's been really, really challenging, both for the Great Lakes and for water issues nationally. And we want to acknowledge that this is a challenging time for clean water issues at the federal level, right up front. I also want to note that from my perch as the president of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, I have the privilege to walk around and travel around to talk to people in cities and counties and states across the Great Lakes region. And I get to go to Canadian provinces and cities in Canada as well who are grappling with freshwater issues. What I hear is a constant drumbeat of support and resilience for Great Lakes and clean water across this region. And that's the spirit in which we are coming to you today to talk about what's possible here in the Great Lakes region and why we're confident that our Great Lakes are going to be protected for today and tomorrow. We have a lot of reasons that we think that's true. We also know that we're facing some serious challenges in the moment when it comes to the federal posture towards the Great Lakes, particularly coming from the White House. And we're going to talk a bit about that as well. I want to say up front, we work on a lot of different issues at the Alliance for the Great Lakes at the federal, state, and local level. No doubt, Megan and I are not going to bring up everything that you may want to hear about. So just want to say that up front. We do a great deal of work at the state level, and feel free to ask questions about anything when we get to that point in the program. But I just want to offer this because a lot of what we're going to talk about today really ends up at the feet of Congress, which is where Megan and I happened to be a couple weeks ago and have some regular outreach to regarding Great Lakes work. So just keep that in mind as we're making announcements, and feel free to, if it's something that we didn't talk about in the chat, we'll try to be as helpful as we can. We're drawing on the information we have from the Alliance's expert staff who work across the region on a whole range of issues. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Megan to start putting some context around what's been sort of good and not so good for our region over the last year. Megan, you want to take it?
Sure, thanks, Joel. And I am getting a message that my internet is occasionally unstable. So please let me know if I cut out at any point and we can look for an alternative here. So I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes about the national picture. As Joel shared in his sort of introductory remarks here, we have been through an unprecedented year in Washington, D.C. that kicked off with a presidential transition and a budget that proposed some significant cuts to core programs and initiatives and services that are critical to support our Great Lakes and the people who depend upon them. And so there was this deep, a major moment of rallying across the region to try to push back against the president's budget, which proposed things like eliminating our state revolving fund programs and our Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And through advocacy done here at the Alliance and across other regional and state-based organizations that care deeply about these issues, and because many of you raised your voices through action alerts and joined us in bringing this story to Congress about the potential impact of these cuts, we are pleased to be able to report that Congress stood tall in the fiscal 2026 budget cycle and protected the great majority of the issues that we care about in the budget. And so we've seen that the GLRI actually has a modest increase of $1 million in its budget for 2026. We've seen that the SRFs did not experience the deep cuts that were initially proposed. And so our water infrastructure funding is largely secure at sort of a flat funding level. There's, of course, continued investments in things like Brandon Road. So it's important as we have the conversation today to understand that there are priorities and values being espoused at the executive level with presidential budgets and initiatives. And then there is the work that Congress is doing to continue to protect the lakes. Now, that said, we do have our eye on the potential for really disruptive cuts that are happening at the agency level. As many of you know, if you were following closely the work of DOGE and the impacts of reductions in force initiatives that were designed to really shrink the size and scope of our federal government, last year alone, the federal workforce declined in size by about 300,000 people. We felt those impacts deeply in places like the Department of the Interior and the US EPA. For the purposes of our Great Lakes National Program Office is smaller today than it has been at any time since the GLRI was adopted. We've seen 40% cuts to our science agencies like the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratories that do critical work to understand and help us look at what are the stressors on the lakes and what can we do to achieve some of our outcomes goals. And then we see that because of these cuts in staffing, although funding may be made available through Congress to continue to operate these programs, if we don't have the people to administer them, that can really undermine the integrity, the efficiency, the effectiveness in their ability to do the work. So again, for example, with it is funded, there are a huge slate of construction projects on deck for 2026 and real challenges in the ability then to make sure that those projects can be implemented as designed and intended. And there have also been continuing concerns about these pocket rescissions. So even if the money is appropriated, will the agencies be able to spend it as intended? Because last year we did see things like funding being held, administrative holds on programs that could have some of these impacts on the ability for the agencies to carry forward their core mission and responsibilities to the lakes. And I'll hand it back over to Joel, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of these other large-scale national trends.
Thanks, Megan. And I just want to emphasize that that's this issue of having will Congress has appropriated the money, but will the agencies actually have the staff and the wherewithal to spend it in the way that Congress directs is something that we are working on very closely and something that you'll want to pay attention to over the next year and several years as these new trends play out. I also want to acknowledge just the regulatory environment that we're in. Not only have we seen a significant drop off in just basic enforcement of water law across the country that unfortunately has been a trend for years. We're seeing some specific regulatory narrowing that, has long-term implications for the Great Lakes. Things like the reduction in the scope of waters that are protected under the Clean Water Act, sometimes referred to as waters of the United States. And we're seeing a push to remove state and tribal authority over Clean Water Act permitting in some cases, particularly as a way to accelerate the development of energy projects. These are efforts that are coming from the top, from US EPA and the White House to pull back the scope of the Clean Water Act and make it easier to pollute in a way that allows for development that is unchecked by our bedrock clean water laws here in the United States. The good news is that those fights are fought at the national level, and we're very supportive of those fights. So the couple of examples that I just mentioned are being fought in federal court by key national partners. Which we are supportive of. And the impacts of those regulatory rollbacks long term those regulatory rollbacks long term will have an impact on the Great Lakes. The upside of that, if there is one, is that it's forcing the states and the Great Lakes states to really examine how well protected their waters are at the state level, and realistically having to step into the breach and being able to take on the role of clean water protector when the federal government isn't doing the job that the Clean Water Act requires. And so that's something that we are working on actively. And again, I know we're here to talk about federal work today, but right now, part of that federal work is understanding where the states need to step in and where the states need to take more action to ensure that there are no gaps in clean water protections. The other thing that I want to mention about the federal scope or the narrowing of the federal scope has been the pullback on environmental justice and climate change. We saw this most visibly in the Great Lakes region with the elimination of references to environmental justice and climate change in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan 4. We've seen it as a sort of administration priority across the board. And what that means is we're actually seeing a pull away from the reality that environmental pollution and environmental damage affects some communities more than others. It affects communities that have less wealth and often that are historically disadvantaged, often are comprised of more Black and brown populations than other communities. And that is a reality that the Great Lakes region continues to deal with. And that's a reality that's backed up by science and data. So we're seeing a pullback from an honest effort to grapple with that reality and make sure that clean water in the Great Lakes are something that are enjoyed or can be enjoyed and relied upon by all. And that has made work to protect clean water more difficult in the current context. The last thing I want to mention before we jump into talking about our federal priorities is the state of U.S.-Canada relations. And this, of course, I think has been, issues of U.S.-Canada relations, particularly through a trade lens, have been a headline almost since the inauguration in 2025. And what we're seeing here is that there is, of course, a lot of debate, or not so much debate, but a lot of focus put on trade barriers that are being erected by the United States. But on the water side, what we're seeing, unfortunately, is a chilling effect on some of the scientific collaboration that typically happens across borders. We're seeing concerns about the ability to travel between the U.S. and Canada that is affecting the ability to collaborate on issues of science and policy, which is a historic strength of our region. Our Great Lakes really depend on binational collaboration and the ability to manage the Great Lakes as it's a single system that cuts across state, provincial, federal, and tribal nation boundaries. And that's being tested right now because of the posture of the U.S. towards Canada at the top level. Fortunately, though, when I work in the Great Lakes spaces at the provincial, state, local level, what I'm hearing is a great enthusiasm for maintaining the partnership that the U.S. and Canada have long had across the Great Lakes. And that's been really encouraging to hear. So while there has been a real challenge at the top federal level and a lot of tension there, there is a great deal of enthusiasm for finding ways to collaborate at other levels of government and across, with nonprofit organizations, understanding how vital it is that the U.S. and Canada maintain this partnership around the Great Lakes. And that's been really encouraging despite some of the chilling effects that we've seen. So with that, I am going to turn things back over to Megan, and she's going to walk us through a few of our federal priorities and talk a little bit about what's possible in 2026.
And if I could just jump in briefly, I forgot to mention at the top, if you would like to ask a question, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can just use that to ask your question, and we'll be getting to those after we talk about those federal priorities. So that's the way for us to hear from you and for us to answer those questions that you have. Over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Joel. So I've been given the tall task of describing in 5 minutes or less all of our federal priorities that we will be bringing to Congress this year. So I'm going to do my very level best. Coming up next month, in March 3rd through 5th, we will be participating in Great Lakes Days. The Healing Our Water Coalition brings together Great Lakes advocates and partners from across the region to raise our voices in a united way in service of a number of federal priorities. So everything that I'm sharing with you today that we at the Alliance for the Great Lakes will be bringing forward to our Illinois delegation and across the region in the conversations that will be coming up in the days ahead. So I'm going to kick us off with a few words about water infrastructure. Across the Great Lakes region, we know that there has been a failure over time to fund at an appropriate level the water infrastructure needs that keep our pipes and our basic water mains safe and create the opportunity to manage flooding and stormwater and avoid drinking water being contaminated with things like lead. So we have this huge backlog of something like $290 billion of need in the Great Lakes region, and we want to ensure that our Great Lakes states are getting the funding that is necessary to address that need, particularly for the communities that have, the greatest experience of disadvantage, that are bearing the brunt of this flooding of lead pipes and contaminated water. And so when we go to Congress, we'll be talking about the need to reauthorize the state clean water and drinking water revolving funds. We will be making sure that our advocates in Congress hear from us about how important it is to ensure that those programs are designed in a way resources to the communities that need them the most, through things like providing grants and forgivable loans that otherwise, without those small communities, disadvantaged areas, rural communities just don't have the ability to take on these big infrastructure projects and the debt that comes with that. We'll also be continuing to advocate to pass a ban on federal water shutoffs and to protect water affordability through federal bills. Let's go to the next slide then, and we'll talk a bit about Great Lakes restoration. So here, our priority is really focused on the reauthorization and fully funding the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Folks who have followed the Alliance for the Great Lakes and this work in the region know that for the last 15 years, the GLRI has been the marquee grant program administered by the EPA in collaboration with 16 federal agencies and across 8 states and in deep partnership with communities and tribes. To really focus on identifying the areas around the Great Lakes that are experiencing legacy pollution and need opportunities to clean up those polluted sites, to protect habitat, to address invasive species. And the GLRI has been the funding program that makes all of that possible. In 15 years, we've cleaned up something like 8,000 sites through these various projects, and it really makes a difference. So as we go to Congress, we'll be continuing to call for this program to be reauthorized and even reauthorized at a higher level of $500 million per year so that this work can continue even as costs to manage these projects increase. Next slide, please. So just a few words on agricultural pollution. Those who live in the Western Lake Erie Basin know firsthand about the harm that hazardous and harmful algal blooms can cause to our waters and make it less pleasant to recreate. It also exposes people and animals to toxic pollution. And the source of those harmful algal blooms is really often upstream in the runoff that is coming off of agricultural farm fields, and that can cause phosphorus to enter the waterways and nitrates. And this causes problems for the ecosystem and for the people who rely on safe, clean drinking water. So on the agriculture front, we want to make sure that we are passing a farm bill. It has been a long time since Congress has taken action to pass and update the farm bill. And we are really focused on ensuring that that farm bill increases funding for critical conservation programs that make it possible to do things in the fields that prevent this runoff in the first place. And we want to make sure that dollars are being targeted and that there is transparency and accountability about where that funding flows to make sure that it is going to the places that are really the greatest sources of this agricultural pollution. Next, please. So with plastic pollution, I know that many folks on the call care passionately about the issue that researchers estimate every year 22 million pounds of plastic pollution are entering our Great Lakes. And again, this is a concern for the ecosystem, and it's also a concern for human health, as the sorts of toxins that are present in plastics can enter our bodies as we consume fish or through our drinking water. And so it is, I think it's a difficult moment in Congress to be too ambitious about what's possible as far as preventing plastic pollution. But there are several bills that we're organizing around in 2026 to try to make, important incremental strides towards addressing plastic pollution at the source. And that includes passing the Plastic Pellet Free Waters Act, the Reuse Act, and the Farewell to Foam Act. So this is, in the case of the industrial pellets, it's really about those tiny little pieces of plastic that are meant to end the manufacturing cycle being turned into, the sorts of plastic that we then experience in our everyday lives. If those pellets get into the environment, they can really wreak havoc. And so I think one step that we would really love to see Congress take this year is make sure that we are taking action to address those plastic pellets in particular, even as we continue to advance a more ambitious agenda that is really about holding producers accountable. And next slide, please. Finally, on the invasive species front, as you see on the slide here, the Alliance continues to be dedicated to addressing invasive species. And I will call out in particular the critical importance of the Brandon Road Lock and Dam project. This has been, an extraordinary effort over a period of many years to secure funding and political will and support to move forward to create these barriers that will keep carp from getting out of the Illinois and Des Plaines River into the Great Lakes. And we have been pleased to see that there is continued support at the state and federal levels to promote this project. We actually broke ground and began construction in 2025, so we are well on our way. But the work is not done. We need to continue to advocate with Congress to appropriate the funds that are necessary for subsequent phases of construction and planning. And we also would love to see the federal government take responsibility for the ongoing operations and management of the Lock and Dam project. It doesn't create a continuing cost burden on the states. So with that, I am going to turn things back over to Joel to reflect on any of our federal priorities that he would like to, and then also to tell us a bit about the year ahead.
Thanks, Megan. I guess one wrap-up thing that I'll say about congressional work overall is that, keeping in mind to everybody that this is an election year and that, it is going to be challenging to move things through Congress in 2026 for a whole variety of reasons. And the fact that it's an election year makes that real. So there are, as Megan said, there are some very specific ways that we think we can continue making progress for the Great Lakes. As I mentioned at the top of my comments, Megan and I were in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and one thing that I've been encouraged by is that Congress, in some ways, seems to have found its voice when it comes to some of these federal Great Lakes programs. There was a lot of frustration in 2025 that there wasn't a lot of public pushback on some of the proposed cuts that the White House was making, and what we saw ultimately it was that a lot of those programs, things that funded For example, as Megan mentioned, the state revolving funds, but also some of the science labs around the Great Lakes region, some of the other federal programs in places like the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers ended up being funded at similar levels to fiscal year 25. And so that's been, and that was a bipartisan decision to fund those programs despite the calls for severe cuts from the White House budget. We still see, though, unfortunately, the loss of staff, the loss of expertise, and big open questions about how that funding will be spent in agencies that may not have the capacity to do so. So coming up, what you should expect to see in the next month or 2 months is the issuance of the annual White House budget. I want to be clear that the White House budget is a request to Congress. It is not the final word. Congress has the authority to spend and needs to use it properly to protect the Great Lakes. But it will be a signal about what the intent of the White House is in this coming year. And we're watching, of course, very carefully to see if that signal continues to be major cuts. The administration did propose at the beginning of last year to protect the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, but other programs, like some of the ones we've talked about today, were purposely. Second thing, I just want to emphasize the importance of monitoring how those agencies are implementing the work. Do we have the capacity to actually spend the billions of dollars that need to be spent in the Great Lakes region each year to restore our water infrastructure, to clean up contaminated sites, to restore fish and wildlife habitats? I just want to share a couple thoughts about the future beyond 2026. I think our federal agencies are being tested on the Great Lakes work like they haven't been before this year or last year. And what that leads me to think about is, what is the future of the federal leadership on the Great Lakes beyond 2026? Where are we going from here? We're seeing a focused effort on pulling back the strength and the expertise of these agencies that have been critical collaborators for the Great Lakes for so long. I think that's an open question, and it's really critical that the Great Lakes region, which means the Alliance, people on this webinar, and thousands of others, start coming together and talking about what are the future needs of our Great Lakes region? What is our expectation, for federal leadership and collaboration? And that's something that's on my mind. Not something that we're going to see an answers to this year, but definitely something that is being called into question, and like it never has been before here for the Great Lakes. So excited to enter into those conversations as well. So with that, I want to turn things back over to Tom. I think we're going to open for some Q&A. We're happy to take questions as they come in.
Yes, we are, Joel. Before we get to that, I just want to alert everyone to the fact that I am putting something into the chat right now that is an action alert. You can take action on these federal priorities right now. This is a request to your members of Congress, when you put in your address, to take action on these federal priorities that we've outlined, and expresses to them how important to you the Great Lakes are. We invite you to take action now, share this with your friends and family, and help spread the word and make this as effective as possible. So Joel mentioned that we are going to get to Q&A now. There's been a lot of great questions that are coming in. A reminder, there's a button. Usually it's at the bottom of your screen. It may be at the top of your screen, so you may have to hunt for it. But it says Q&A. You can submit a question there, and we can get to it. Joel and Megan, I'm not sure if there's a question you wanted to start with. If not, I'm happy to start us off with a question about Brandon Road.
Go ahead, Tom.
Sure.
Can I just say a word about the action alert before we pivot into the Q&A? I did just want to share, having recently been in DC and in talking with our representatives, the drumbeat that I hear is how important personal stories are in this moment. And the more that you, as someone who cares about the Great Lakes, can talk in personal ways about, if you work on Great Lakes science, what have the impacts of these cuts meant for your ability to ensure that we've got good data about what's going on within our ecosystem? If you are someone who has been employed as a federal employee and your job was impacted, if you care about your water infrastructure and you've experienced flooding, the more that you can use this action alert as a moment to both ensure that your elected officials are hearing this, but also that the Alliance can collect these stories and continue to use them in our direct advocacy, that is so powerful and can really help to shape a compelling message as we enter into another budget cycle. So now you were going to ask a question about Brandon Road, Tom. Go for it.
I was, but thank you. It's important to understand firsthand the effect of those action alerts and those stories that people are sharing. So thanks for underlining that. The first question is from Gary. It is about Brandon Road, and he's wondering about the exact funding status. And there has been some back and forth on pauses, and also the fact that Michigan and Illinois, as far as states go, have contributed funding. And kind of what are we looking for long term with funding on that?
Megan, you want me to take that one? Okay, so yeah, the good news, of course, that this Gary mentioned in that question was that Illinois and Michigan have contributed state funds to that project. The funding for phase one construction was actually this is federal money. The funding for phase one construction was actually provided through the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2022. There has been this year there's definitely been some evidence that funding is being there's like an administrative hold on some Army Corps funding nationally that may affect Brandon Road, but so far we haven't seen an impact to this actual project. This project is under construction. Federal money and the state and the corresponding state match is being spent to implement phase one construction, right? So that's a good thing. We also saw last year that there was, as I'm sure many people on this webinar saw, some back and forth between Illinois Governor Pritzker and President Trump about this project. Governor Whitmer from Michigan was engaged. The upshot of all that was that there was an executive order issued that prioritized this project for the Army Corps and actually, stated that this project should move forward with, all speed and efficiency. I don't remember the exact language off the top of my head. So one good outcome of that is that the Corps is trying, as I understand it, is trying to make phase two construction go forward in parallel with phase one. And so they're working on the design of the second phase of the project. And if there is funding provided by Congress in the fiscal year 27 appropriations, that would be this fall or possibly into next year, depending on how the appropriation cycle goes. The Corps could actually start phase two construction while it's still completing phase one. So that would be a really good thing. So the focus, and this is in the details of our federal advocacy positions on our website, the focus needs to be on getting that phase two construction money moving, which could actually help this project move forward faster than expected.
Thanks, Joel. The next question is about agricultural pollution, which we mentioned as one of our priorities. The question is, what do you see as being the greatest source or sources of agricultural pollution, and are there particular sources that you would like to focus on?
I can start. There's a lot of them, and it depends on where you are. In Western Lake Erie, for example, it's a combination of manure. Manure that's being spread largely from concentrated animal feeding operations, chemical fertilizers that are being applied to the soil, and what we call legacy phosphorus. So phosphorus that's actually in the soil and has historically been there, largely from that soil kind of being overloaded with too much nutrient over the years, and all that combines. In other places, it's different. So for example, Green Bay, the primary sources are manure and municipal wastewater treatment, as an example, and chemical fertilizer application is less of an issue. The upshot of it is that we're putting too much phosphorus on the land, and it's washing off into our water bodies. So we have to look at what we can control. We can control how much phosphorus gets applied, whether that's chemical or whether that's manure. This is one of the reasons that we've been part of a coalition, for example, in Michigan, that is supporting the state of Michigan to uphold new rules that limit the amount of phosphorus or the amount of manure that can be spread on lands, which is actually in litigation right now with being led by our partners at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. But it's really critical that the states are able to regulate the amount of phosphorus or the amount of nutrient that's put on the soil in ways that make sure that nutrient doesn't end up in water bodies that then leads to toxic algae blooms. So try to make that a short answer to a very complicated question. But just Megan, feel free to add to that if you got anything you want to share.
I saw a thumbs up from Megan, so I will move on to the next question. This one is about some of the tactics around advocating to Congress and who you talk to and who you don't talk to. So Michael asked about, we talked to our advocates in Congress, but I wanted to ask, is it just people who agree with us in Congress? Do we talk to everyone in Congress? What is the strategy behind who we talk to? Is it just people from Great Lakes states or representatives from Great Lakes states or other states, whether they're advocating for the issues we care about or not?
A really important question. And we are fortunate in our Great Lakes states to have, and particularly, here in Illinois, and in places like Michigan, to have longstanding and strong voices in Congress who support the Great Lakes, who champion the bills that we are asking them to. But the work doesn't stop there, right? It is necessary for us as part of a coordinated federal strategy to make sure that we are regularly meeting with staffers and with representatives where we can, across, in a bipartisan way, across lines of difference, to make sure that folks understand why the Great Lakes have historically been and should continue to be a bipartisan issue. We've got, sometimes unlikely friends in Congress who happen to have a personal connection to the lake and who have really stood up even when there have been, political dynamics that have made that challenging. And we want to continue to be, open to conversations with everyone who will speak with us. So when we go to Great Lakes Days, for example, the Alliance for the Great Lakes serves as the Illinois state lead. We will be meeting with all of our delegates in Congress, and we will be very excited to carry these messages, so that we make sure that we are working affirmatively to build new allies wherever we can in this work.
Yeah, I agreed 100%. And I also want to emphasize how critical it is to recognize that these water issues they are statewide, region-wide issues, right? They're not just of one political party. And a couple examples I'll share, is the issue of drinking water safety and groundwater contamination. Groundwater is connected to our surface waters. It's all, one big system. And the issue of drinking water contamination hits hard, both in urban and in rural areas, and pointing out that the reasons for that contamination might be different. So things like lead are obviously different from nitrate contamination from agriculture sources, or PFAS contamination from industrial sources. But, one of the great things about the Great Lakes, and as an advocate, I would suggest, is digging into how those water contamination issues connect different parts of the state that you're in, different parts of the region you're in, that often cut across political lines. I have found that when you're talking about drinking water safety and you're talking about ensuring that communities have access to safe and healthy water in a variety of ways, whether it's drinking or recreation, or protection from flooding, that is a way that you really get connected to members of Congress who come from differing political backgrounds. And it's really critical to share that message and make sure that those, again, as Tom or somebody mentioned earlier, that the knowledge of how those issues are impacting areas of multiple political persuasions are being shared with members of Congress. And Megan mentioned we're out in DC in a couple of weeks talking to the Illinois delegation. Other times of the year we work with delegations across the region, and certainly with a whole variety of partners to reach decision makers throughout the Great Lakes states.
I think the question was also asking about ways in which we might build coalition beyond the Great Lakes states. And I think there are some nice examples of that in cases like plastic pollution, right? Where many of our coastal state partners are also similarly very concerned about the impacts of plastics entering our oceans. And so how do we build power and build alliance, even in places like Florida that are doing some interesting work in state to try to think about this as a challenge, and bridge that to places like Ohio, so working to bring lawmakers together to do shared education that sometimes even reaches beyond the Great Lakes region can be a really effective organizing strategy. So thanks for that question.
That is a good segue on plastics to a question about plastics. We've gotten a couple of them. This question is from Benjamin. With a variety of legislation proposals directed towards plastic pollution, which proposal may lead to the greatest impact, and will any be more feasible to pass than others?
Do you want Megan, you want me to start on
Either
that
one? You can start, sure.
I mean, I'll go big and then I'll go small. I know the question is about the greatest impact. I think there are a lot of ways that advocates are approaching the plastics issue. Some folks are focused on, the waste stream, recycling and reclamation. Some folks are focused on reuse. We're really focused on what we call, this is the question about the biggest impact, extended producer responsibility. And so the, very short version of that is making sure that companies that produce plastic by the way they do business are responsible for making sure that it doesn't become an environmental pollutant. And this is an approach that we've advocated for both at the federal and the state level. I think there are ways that the Great Lakes region's states have the opportunity to be a leader. But so the short answer is, if we can change the way that the life cycle of plastic is managed, so we account for the environmental damage before it happens, and we build that into how that plastic is produced and used, that's most likely to reduce the sources of plastic that are getting into our water, and for that matter, our air and our land. That's also going to be a really heavy lift at the federal level. I just want to be honest about that. So there are opportunities for the states to take the lead. Other avenues that I think are really important to raise up that aren't maybe not have as much of an impact right away, but might be faster to implement. One, this gets a little wonky, but it's laundry filtration, for example. Like there are ways that we could, at a large scale, reduce the amount of plastic that's going into our waters, such as through, filtering plastic fibers out of laundry wastewater. And that's something that's being studied both in science and in policy across the country. Again, a great opportunity that's becoming more likely to be practical every single year. And then there are efforts like just plain old monitoring. Monitoring is really critical because for example, if US EPA were to require the states to monitor for plastic in their waste, or for utilities to monitor microplastics in their waste streams, it starts to give us information about what's going into our water that we don't have right now. If we can commit to sort of binationally consistent monitoring protocols with the US and Canada, it gives us information that we don't have right now about where that plastic is coming from. And so, things like monitoring and looking at a single source are perhaps won't be as impactful as say passing extended producer responsibility legislation nationally, but they are really important steps as we grapple with a global problem here in the Great Lakes. And we try to focus at the Alliance on what can keep plastic out of our water specifically, and that's where our focus is going to continue to be.
Thanks, Joel. We've also gotten quite a few questions on water use and data centers, which is certainly a hot topic in the region and nationally. A representative question is, with many Great Lakes states being targeted for data center development, with the massive water requirements of data centers and the lack of policy and regulation related to data centers, what can we do to protect the Great Lakes? This is especially concerning given how many people rely on the lakes and groundwater for drinking water.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off on this question. So as it sounds like many of you on the call are aware, the Alliance has been deeply involved and invested in learning about the impacts of data centers and an array of other large water users, including increasing demands from agriculture as we need to apply more water to grow our crops as we have a warming climate. There are other forms of industry that are proliferating around the basin, like chip manufacturers. And so taken together, this presents a real concern for the potential water demands that these industries are going to create. And are we prepared as a region to understand where these stresses are going to be felt most acutely across the region, to help our government decision makers make more informed decisions about where siting and development of these facilities can happen in a way that isn't going to create additional strain and the potential for water shortages or groundwater contamination? And so we've been doing a lot of research and a lot of organizing in this space. What we have found is that most of the policy solutions to this problem are really state level policy solutions. We need to work on things like transparency as developments are being proposed so that there's a better sense up front of their water demands. We need to work on groundwater studies so that we do have kind of a better understanding of the landscape. We need more permitting requirements. We need to require conservation and efficiency standards. And many of these sort of solutions are really state level policy levers and involve local decision making in some cases. So as we think about the federal perspective here, we know, just facing facts. There is strong support for deregulation across the board, but particularly in the area of data centers, and a lot of work that has been done to try to create a enabling environment where proliferate nationally. So when we think about the federal opportunities here, we're really looking at things like there's a bill that would provide a 30% tax credit to scale up water reuse within these facilities that we think could be an important contribution. And there are a lot of defensive plays here where we want to make sure that we stand up for federalism, and we say that although the federal government is attempting to make it more difficult for states to regulate these kinds of industries, we think it's really important that states maintain this kind of power and decision-making and ability, to make choices that are right for their state and for their water resources. And so we want to continue, to protect what has been enshrined in law, about the state authorities here. And we also want to support nationally efforts to develop these conservation and efficiency standards. So this is becoming increasingly, sort of an additional pillar of the Alliance's body of work, and you'll be hearing more from us, and certainly, more conversation in the context of our state level work too, about efforts that we're taking along those lines.
Thanks, Megan. There's a great summary, and I just want to lift up that point that you made about state sovereignty. One of the reasons, this is not part of our federal priorities conversation, up front today, because it is, as Megan said, largely a state issue. And I just wanted to lift up how much of a leader the Great Lakes states have been in protecting our water supply. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Great Lakes Water Resources Compact, which bans, with some limited exceptions, bans diversions of water from the Great Lakes, requires all water that's used from the Great Lakes to be returned to the Great Lakes after it's used. And importantly on this specific question is it requires the states to set up water use programs that have a common baseline across the Great Lakes region. So that was one of the things, the compact didn't just ban diversions, it also mandated that the states set up these water use programs in common. And we're seeing that being tested right now with the data center question. And so we are very active on that issue at the state level. And it's critical that the states really stand up for and protect their sovereignty when it comes to managing their water resources, their water supply. The Great Lakes states, again, have been leaders on that, and we're here to make sure that continues, and we continue to have that leadership and that sovereignty, maintained over water use decisions. That's not subject to, some sort of, federal mandate that reduces protections for our water supply.
Thanks. We have some questions about the science aspect. You mentioned cuts to science programs. This is a question from Benjamin. You talked about the importance of sharing personal stories with legislators and making the greatest impacts. How might this extend to scientists? What are you doing to ensure that water policy across federal and or state is fundamentally supported by the most current and up-to-date research? And I'm going to add to that another question about science. If science-based staffing is being cut, does that not lead to funds being underspent and then effectively not spent and further budget cuts? And I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of those two pieces and also that just fundamental piece of, okay, we're talking about science-based work. What is the impact of that science-based work on our day-to-day lives?
I mean, I love this question. Somebody who is like paying attention to how federal budgets work, asking this question. So I'm going to start with the very practical part about budgets not being underspent and then the potential impacts. And I do see that there's some kind of a collision course happening here, right? So this is probably oversimplifying, but I'll start with saying, the White House requested that some programs, science programs and other programs that affect the Great Lakes were zeroed out or dramatically cut. Congress, over the course of many months, heard a lot of pushback on that from people like you and lots of others, and said, no thanks. We're going to fund the Great Lakes National Program Office. We're going to fund the lab. We're going to fund the science labs. We're going to fund these federal agencies programs that the Great Lakes rely on. We're going to fund the water infrastructure programs. So now you've got this situation where programs that were targeted for being severely cut or zeroed and programs where there have been staff cuts are now being funded consistent with past levels. And so the question of what happens over the next 6 to 12 months, will that money get spent? Are there enough people to actually deliver those resources? Will the research agendas that those programs and agencies have actually be fulfilled, we don't know, right? Because it really depends on how those agencies are able to manage those funds with the staff that they have right now. But suffice to say, it's concerning, and we're in what the dynamic that the person asking the question mentioned about, if money goes unspent, does it get given back and then lead to potential, future cuts to those programs? That is definitely a possibility, and that's something that we really want to be aware of. So getting the funding in place is one thing, getting the actual work done and showing, that meets the need is very much another. To I guess the more sort of existential question of like, how do we rely on this science? One of the examples I think of that's relatively recent is around Muskegon Lake up in Michigan. And there's stories like this all across the Great Lakes region, but where you've seen a combination of academic science, right, from institutions like Grand Valley State University, citizen science, local community engagement, local business engagement, and local elected official engagement, all kind of combining to lead to the eventual cleanup and what we call delisting. So the removal of an area of concern, a contaminated area from that list over many years. Those component pieces were all critical in addition to the funding to get to the positive result of saying this area is cleaned up, it can be redeveloped, it can be used and enjoyed in a way that it wasn't before. And I think there's an example out there. Every time you see one of these Great Lakes restoration projects or cleanup projects, you see the impact of, federally funded science actually on the ground that's been happening for decades leading up to those points, the point where you can actually say, okay, yeah, mission accomplished, this place is cleaned up. Likewise, I'll say, I'll put in another plug for things like federal science around drinking water safety. We know, one of the things that we have relied on, which unfortunately has been cut and manipulated in other ways, is, can we rely on federal standards to demonstrate that our drinking water is safe? Do the scientists, both whether they're federal employees or whether they are advisors coming from academic institutions and elsewhere, do they have the freedom, the academic freedom to rely on their data and describe, the facts the way that they are to show whether our drinking water is safe from contaminants like lead or from nitrates? That's another way that, scientific integrity really shows up or needs to be showing up for the Great Lakes. I could go on and on about this topic, but I'll leave it at that. It's a really good one, looking for the ways that scientific data has connected to clean water outcomes in your community, and showing that to our decision makers is critical.
Thanks, Joel. This will be our final question as we wrap up. This is actually more of a comment than a question, so it's a chance to talk a little bit more about the U.S.-Canada relationship. Kareth is on the call and wanted to say your friends from Quebec are here and continuing to engage in our binational regional forums despite challenges on both sides of the border. I'm wondering if there's anything else that either you or Megan would like to add about some of the challenges you're seeing in that U.S.-Canada relationship, or the continued cooperation that's kind of happening at the binational regional level.
Well, I talked about shared science earlier. It kind of is a good dovetail into that last question. And I just, not everybody on this webinar may be aware of it, but there's a massive science infrastructure that goes across the international border and really, it follows the Great Lakes themselves, which, don't respect that border, the water flows. And that's something that is critical to protect, preserve, and uplift, as we go through some of these federal challenges. I also think that it's just incumbent on all of us to make more efforts. For example, I'm in the U.S. Most of our work is based in the United States, to really be in regular conversation with our Canadian partners. One of the things that last year, one of the most urgent series of calls and sort of outreach I got was when it was perceived that there were potentially risks to international agreements on water quality and water quantity. And there were a lot of questions coming from our Canadian counterparts about, is this real? Is this actually happening? Or how can we help to prevent any sort of impact or assault on our water protections at a binational scale? So those conversations are very active, and we have to keep them that way. I think that again, as I said earlier, there's the there's the dynamic, at one level of government, and then there's the dynamic in our whole region. And everything that I've seen over the last year has shown me that whether you're talking about state and local elected officials, scientists, nonprofit folks like us, the enthusiasm for respecting and energizing that water relationship with Canada from the US and vice versa is very much still alive, and something that we are sort of carrying through what is a really challenging time on the diplomatic front. So Megan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
I might just add that I had the opportunity to attend my first Great Lakes Public Forum recently. It was hosted at the Region 5 offices, and it brought together representatives from the EPA and Canada's Water Agency. And it was an extraordinary opportunity to celebrate progress under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, to talk about the work that is happening in both the United States and Canada, and often in collaboration to continue to advance the state of the Great Lakes goals. And there was such a feel in the room that we have shared fate here. We are in this work together. We have done, over a period of decades, what needed to be done to establish these goals that continue to animate the work in the region, and that continue to be such a powerful bind and source of shared opportunity between the US and Canada. And coming into that space, I didn't know, what the feel might be, what the temperature was around some of these binational relations questions. And I came out feeling like, at least at this level of agency collaboration and project level, science level, sort of shared sense of continued shared purpose is there and remains strong. And so that was heartening for me.
Oh, Joel, did you want to jump in?
No, I know we're wrapping up. I just wanted to say another thank you. I really appreciate you all listening and asking questions. And, I know, I'm sure we'll hear from many of you in the year to come, but thank you for making the time today.
Yes, and thank you, Megan and Joel, as well. Thanks, everyone out there. Really appreciate it. We will follow up via email with a link to this recording, and also a link to that action alert. Please spread that far and wide. Thank you so much for your support of what we do. That is what makes it all possible. If you would like to learn anything more about us or make a donation, you can do that on greatlakes.org. And with that, we will let you get back to the rest of your day. Thanks so much for your interest in protecting the Great Lakes. Bye.